the age of the Victorian Empire, of the Industrial Revolution. Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901, was ruled during a global empire. Britain rose to dominate the world. It was a time of rigid manners, high morals, and strong emphasis on appearances. But beneath the tidy corsets and lace gloves and polished manners, a shadow world thrived. Behind red-curtained windows, down dim alleys, and through back doors, lay a secret world barely acknowledged by most, the brothels of Victorian England. We pull the curtain back on the world that Victorian society didn't want to speak yet, couldn't live without. In this chapter, to understand the emergence of the brothel at this time, one must begin by understanding the Victorians. It was an era obsessed with morality, virtue, and the sanctity of the family. Middle and upper class Victorians were known for strict codes of conduct, especially where women were concerned. A true woman was to be pure, obedient, and domestic. Sexuality, particularly female sexuality, was something that was not to be talked about, shrouded in euphemism and silence. And yet, prostitution flourished. Why? Because Victorian society had a blatant double standard. Men were permitted, indeed, encouraged to experiment sexually outside the bounds of marriage. It was considered a biological necessity in a man's life to ensure good health and virility. Women, meanwhile, were either Madonnas or whores to the public. There was no in-dash between in this way. While prostitution was rampant, it was also institutionalized. London had grown into a vast metropolis by the mid-19th century. More than 2.5 million people lived there. Thousands had flocked to the city in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, and not all had prospered. Poverty, starvation, and disease were everywhere. For the majority of women, the vast majority of whom had no families or education, prostitution was the only choice of survival. In 1857, the British government claimed that there were over 80,000 prostitutes walking the streets in London alone, a staggering statistic, and likely more modest than the truth. Brothels could be opulent parlour houses for the rich, or disease-ridden rooms in the tenements of the East End. Such establishments were frequently euphemistically disguised under such names as dancing academies, massage parlours, or boarding houses. The police knew, the politicians knew, the public knew, but for the most part they looked the other way. As long as it was done on the down low, all brothels were not created equal. There was a clear class hierarchy within the sex trade. Upmarket brothels, or parlour houses, generally set up in more affluent areas such as Mayfair, Bloomsbury, and Soho. These were nice, well-furnished places operated by experienced madams, including many who hailed originally from the ranks of prostitutes who had retired into management. The common prostitutes in these brothels were mostly slaves, those sworn free by the state and remaining in the worst, cheapest, dirtiest houses, who had no right to be taken in marriage or given a decent burial. A few even boasted repeat customers, from the nobility, such as lords, members of parliament, and military officers. For these men, going to a brothel was not only about sex, it was about power, anonymity, and friendship without obligation. As one visitor described it, the brothels of the middle range catered to clerks, tradespeople, and soldiers. They were crude but serviceable. The women there weren't trained, but the experience was more accessible. Less expensive. At the bottom were the street walkers and common lodging house workers, women that worked in dark alleys, parks, or to rent a cheap room by the hour. These women were often destitute, sometimes addicted to alcohol or opium, and highly susceptible to abuse and disease. Behind each of these successful brothels stood a strong woman, the madam. These women had a good deal of power in a society that otherwise allowed women very little freedom. An adept madam could also be very rich, was respected within her sphere, and was feared. Others were savvy female entrepreneurs who kept meticulous books, employed a staff, bribed local police, and instilled strict rules in their venues. Others, however, were ruthless exploiters. Many of the trafficked girls were from rural areas, or from outside the country, luring them into debt and servitude. Once a girl entered the prostitution system, it was the hardest thing to get out, certainly, not without help from someone with power. Prostitution was not an offence in Victorian England, but matters connected to it like soliciting in public, operating a brothel, or living off immoral earnings could be. In reality, however, the law had been selectively enforced. Police corruption was widespread. Officers routinely took bribes or free services to look the other way. In some sections, whole districts became, in effect, unofficial red light, despite places where local police turned a blind eye to the vice because they wanted it contained. Contagious Diseases Acts 1864, 1866 and 1869. One of the most notorious efforts to regulate prostitution was the Contagious Diseases Acts. These laws permitted police to arrest and subject to invasive examination any woman perceived to have a job related to prostitution in communities near military bases. Its purpose was to prevent the transmission of venereal diseases to soldiers. But it was really a system that subjected thousands of women to invasive physical exams, incarceration, and public humiliation. Of course, the acts didn't extend. Two men, upholding the gendered double standard. The backlash, which was led by the activist Josephine Butler, inspired a women's rights movement across the nation and a challenge to Victorian views on sexuality and civil liberties. Why did so many women end up working as prostitutes? Simple. Money. A maid-of-all-work might make £8, £10 a year. A prostitute in a high-end brothel might make that in a month, in some cases, a week. For uneducated women, with no rights at work or a male protector, sex work was generally the most profitable job option. Yet this money was not free. Exploitation, violence, disease, pregnancy, and social censure were always looming. And for the few to whom age made unattractive or illness unfitting, there was no pension, no safety net. Throughout the Victorian era, prostitution remained a source of social ambivalence. It was poison, he declared, and while a few saw tobacco as a necessary evil, many others waged pitched battles to drive from the land a noxious weed. Moral reformers such as William Tate, Henry Mayhew and Charles Booth published sensational exposes of urban poverty and the sex trade in a bid to shock the public into action. Churches and charities set up rescue homes for fallen women, many of which were little better than prisons that focused on repentance, not rehabilitation. Still, these initiatives laid the groundwork for wider conversations about women's rights, education, and public health. They also exposed the ugly underbelly of a society that valued appearance over compassion. Brothel clients were not all laborers and sailors. They were aristocrats and doctors and lawyers and clergy. Women who needed work to support themselves resorted to turning tricks. Other men viewed engaging in prostitution as a means of sexual liberation that didn't infringe their wives' purity. For some of them, a prostitute was a form of emotional refuge, a place where they could just be themselves without criticism. These escapades were often about much more than just sex. Some men would have relationships with prostitutes, pay for their lodgings or try to save them in the long term, proposing to marry them or give them a job. But most often, these stories were ones of heartache or neglect. The hypocrisy of Victorian masculinity, the separation from a man's public honor and private indulgent self, was one of the era's most conspicuous hypocrisies. And so we end this chapter with a stunning realization. Brothels in 19th century England were not aberrations. They were woven into the moral fabric of ordinary life, visible but unseen, as it were. They were a reflection of the failure and function of a society obsessed with order, yet riddled with contradictions. In the following chapters, I will take readers further into this hidden world, into the lives of the women who called it home, and worked there, the rooms they inhabited, the diseases they battled, the power plays they withstood, the rare glimmerings of autonomy they forged there among the shadows. The gaslights may go out, the cobblestones may be pass, but their stories are there to be told. If the streets of Victorian London muttered secrets, the brothels screamed them behind locked doors. In this chapter, we head indoors. Between the lace curtains, the storefront windows, the gaslight, and the sturgeon moon, we inhabit the lives of the women history forgot. What was it like to wake up each day inside a brothel during Queen Victoria's reign? What were the habits, the rituals, the risks, the gestures of humanity in a life that a society deemed shameful? Let us start not with scandal, but with the sound of footsteps in a wood hallway, as another long day starts behind the veil. For the majority of brothel workers, mornings began not with sunlight pouring through the windows, but with weariness. Work often went late into the night, sometimes 3 or 4 a.m. after the last client left. Cleanup, restocking linens, and sometimes painful medical self-treatments followed. If there had been injuries, the order of the brothel determined how the day would start. In more expensive brothels, the madam, or rather the brothel keeper himself, would make sure a breakfast, usually consisting of bread and tea with maybe some meat, or even better, porridge was ready for customers. The women ate together in a simple kitchen or dining room, sometimes in silence, sometimes laughing or passing bitter gossip. In the low-end brothels, there was hardly ever food unless the women paid for it themselves. A great many had been entirely without breakfast. Their stomachs were turned by fatigue, by alcoholic excess, or by malaise. Hygiene was minimal. In some of the poorest dwellings, women bathed weekly, if at all. A tin basin, a piece of rag and a pail of lukewarm water had frequently to do for the purpose. Brothels took many shapes, from fine townhouses in Westminster to falling down tenements in wire rooms were generally small, with a bed, basin, mirror, and small chest for belongings. At the middle level, prostitutes often shared rooms or worked in shifts, depending on the volume of business. In sumptuous brothels, women enjoyed private and extremely comfortable quarters, with walls hung with velvet curtains, woodwork geared with oil lamps, and even cosmetic tables. But even in the pleasantest environs, the women had little respite. Madams had their hands in every facet of their lives: time, money, what they wear, when they come in. Some of the brothels were like boarding houses and maintained order through fines or the lash. Even more inhumane was debt bondage. A girl could come to the city with work promised domestic, only to find herself sinking in a brothel, her wages shrinking as she owed more and more in rent, clothes and fees for food, and sometimes even charged for burning excessive oil in her lamp. She couldn't leave until the debt was paid. By afternoon, preparations began. Clothing was not simply about covering up, it was a ritual of transformation. Clothes were armor, allure, identity. In luxury board, women were carefully dressed in the most extravagant corsets, petticoats, perfumes, and finery. Some costumed to fit client fantasies, Greek goddesses, Egyptian queens, medieval maidens. Makeup was crucial, though women condemned for respectability could never wear cosmetics. In the brothel world, rouge, kohl, and powders were part of the business, with red lips, painted on cheeks, and darkened eyes. It made women edgy and seductive, and frightful in poorer houses. Clothing might be worn, often cast off. Dresses were taken in and taken out, occasionally sewn haphazardly between customers. There was no finery, but the objective was the same: to be a fantasy, if only for a moment. Brothels would officially open for business at the end of late afternoon or early evening. Clients began arriving around dusk. The front parlor was the parlor where men would meet the girls, converse and negotiate prices. Fancier brothels had a system for selection, in which the clients were offered tea or champagne or cigars. While they wait, the air was filled with music, played frequently on a piano or a harp. The women were to charm the guests. Wit and flirtation were equally important as looks. When selected, the client would go upstairs. Encounters could last from 10 minutes to several hours, depending on payment and services provided. Working-class brothels, on the other hand, didn't have that kind of beauty. Fights were a quick, mechanical, brutal thing. Little foreplay, no false advertising. The rooms were nearly always filthy, the bedding reused with hardly more than a quick swab between guests. Violence was common and rarely reported. The effects of sex work on the body were devastating. Sexual relations without protection became an ongoing problem, causing internal injuries, infections, and tearing, as well as making them tired. There were condoms made from sheep intestines or rubber, but they were costly and something most clients disliked. What most worried him was venereal disease. Syphilis and gonorrhea were rampant. In a pre-antibiotic era, there were ointments and other poisonous treatments, such as arsenic. These were also painful, ineffective, and frequently further aggravated the patient's condition. Pregnancy was another constant risk. Abortions were prohibited and perilous, often conducted with sharp devices, chemicals or potions. Many women died, others deserted their children or sent them to baby farms, where infants often died from neglect. Such patients who visibly became ill were often rejected by them. Having fallen lacking of the profit motive, they ended up as beggars, in workhouses, or dead in some back alley. In spite of the inhumanity of the trade, they often loved each other. They borrowed clothes and shielded one another from violent clients, and swapped tips on how to survive illness or please clients. Some brothels had a genuine sense of sisterhood, if always tempered by competition for clients. They fought, as well as argued, with some frequency. Add to that alcohol and drugs, including opium and laudanum, and volatility increased. Jealousy, a madam's favoritism, theft accusations. The real enemy could be anyone, but in stiller moments, while braiding hair, while sewing, while singing, while weeping, the women provided one another temporary comfort. They were all the family each other had. Among the men who patronized the brothels were those from all walks of life. Some were brutal, transactional, silent before and after. Others were oddly tender, treating the encounter as if it were a romantic tryst. Some became regulars, keepers who offered gifts, paid rent, or offered promises of escape. These relationships were complex. Some women fell in love, some faked it. Some clients proposed marriage, often withdrawn after a night of sober. Second thought, the women learned to size up men fast. Weaknesses, desires, and limits. It was a matter of survival as much as of professional livelihood. One ex-prostitution worker wrote in a diary, "I know more of men, and of them, more than any lady in her drawing room ever will. I have looked behind their cowl that they wear, for their wives, contrary to common assumptions, many women working in brothels were religious. Some prayed nightly. Bibles were not unusual in the dark-celled bedrooms of brothels, pushed next to pots of rouge and bottles of perfume. They were not blind to the contradiction. A lot knew they were already damned but hoped for redemption. Still others perceived themselves as victims, not of their own sin, but of circumstance. Some even tithed a share of their earnings to local churches, though they were hardly ever welcomed outright. Paige Cowley would escape occasionally through reading, poetry, and music. Many women who could read did read books aloud. Go-tos were Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters. The stories of struggle and injustice and complicated women struck a deep chord. As the last client left, the brothel found itself in a liminal void. Not morning yet, without a doubt no longer night. The women stripped, removed their makeup, washed to the extent possible, and fell into bed. Some cried, some smoked. Others gazed, glassy-eyed at the ceiling, tallying these things: coins, bruises, regrets, in nicer houses. Earnings were shared between the woman and the madam, in some cases 50/50ths, others worse. Many women there owed more than they earned, stuck in cycles of paying rent, fines, and reliance. Sleep was a reprieve, not a respite. Tales of bordello women marrying rich clients or eloping to country homes were dramatic fiction, and reality was harsher. Very few escaped. The ones who did had assistance from either family or reformers or clients willing and able to keep their word. But most who left one brothel ended up in another, travelling from parlour in the West End to hovel in the East End until they were of no further use. There were reform homes, operated by religious or philanthropic groups, but they were harsh. Redemption came at the price of harsh discipline, moral exhortation, and hard labour. Prostitutes, women in the sex trade, would make a decision about whether to go to the workhouse or commit suicide. What the women of Victorian brothels did was hardly for the ages. They didn't leave monuments, portraits, descendants to cherish their good works. Their files are scattered across court dockets, medical journals, police reports, and, in the worst cases, sometimes only in whisper. Yet they lived, they endured. In a world that denied them everything, they found their moments of dignity. They laughed, cried, loved, suffered, and yearned for better. Their tales are not important because they were salacious, but because they were human. The brothel was more than a location. It was a living thing. Its lungs swelled with laughter, and, weeping, reverberated to the tread and the sigh. Sanctuary, but also snare. In this chapter we tour the halls of the Victorian brothel, from its gilded parlours to its crumbling cellar. A story in every hallway, bedpost, window. In Victorian England, it was a hierarchy-driven society, so of course that social order extended to the design and layout of brothels. Brothels were rarely purpose-built. They were not built. They were carved out of existing homes, boarding houses, or inns. The city's own design kept them in plain sight. In posh areas, they had been tucked discreetly into Georgian townhouses, their outward appearances no different from respectable dwellings. In the East End, brothels could be found in decaying tenements or above a tavern. What made a house a brothel was not simply who worked there, but the way it was structured. Parlour houses, as the upper-tier brothels were known, were similar in appearance to luxurious boarding houses or gentlemen's clubs. They occupied high-end areas such as Mayfair, Bloomsbury, and Knightsbridge, and they were brothels primarily focused on serving the wealthy elite. Exterior and entry. The exterior would look much like the outside of other upscale homes. Brass knockers, clean windows, a fresh coat of paint. Others had a kind of code, a red curtain drawn in the second-floor window, a particular flower pot in the windowsill, or a discreet red light shining behind lace, cigapon walking through the door. Customers would enter a vestibule or foyer, shifting zone that was frequently graced with oriental rugs, brass umbrella stands and coat racks. A servant whose occupation is maid or housekeeper, it was to show him into the drawing parlor. The parlor. This was the heart of the place, a verdant, enveloping drawing room meant to soothe and seduce. Here women were assembled, rigged out to the best advantage, for selection. The furniture was in velvet or damasked. The lighting was soft. There was a screen behind it all, red and gold silk lampshades set against it to filter the light. There might be a piano or a harp off in the corner. There were books, brandy decanters, and the daily paper appeared to give an air of culture. Conversation was expected. Clients weren't in a hurry. This was foreplay of a social variety. Private rooms. The boudoirs were upstairs, each one individually decorated, with some clearly themed. Others mimicked exotic places. A Turkish harem, a Chinese tea house, a Roman temple. Still others pursued literary fantasies, Shakespearean rooms, Gothic chambers, or fairy tale themes. The beds were big, some of them four-poster, with draping for privacy. Mirrored walls were not uncommon. A few of the rooms contained small wash basins, or requested access to hot water, quite a luxury in Victorian England. Each had a set of rules, typically enforced by the madam of the house: how long they could stay, what was and wasn't allowed, the price range. 95% of brothels were upper middle class, if there is such a thing as the common brothel. They tended to be middle-class facilities, typically operated by a madam with maybe a couple of regular girls. They serviced clerks, merchants, tradesmen. These could be found in mixed-class locations, frequently on the same street as shops, bakeries, or print houses. Layout. The entry was more plain. No frills, no signals. All it took was a knock, a password, or even a familiar face. Visitors passed through a nondescript sitting room or hallway. There were a few rooms to be had above, hardly furnished, with bed, washstand, and a crock, and one candle or lamp. Decor. Decor here was functional. Walls were sometimes papered, more frequently left bare. Sheets were reused unless stained. The floorboards creaked. You had no privacy. The voices of rooms gossiped through thin walls. Yet some women found a way to personalize their environments with small touches. A drawing pinned to the wall, a keepsake, a hidden stash of letters. Utilities: running water was rare. Heat in the house, if the house could afford it, was from coal fires. Odors lingered. There was no maid service. Women cleaned their own rooms, or not. At the bottom were the whorehouses of despair, common lodging houses, single-room tenements, back alley flats where sex work unfolded in horror and filth. These were frequently one-room affairs, available for rent by the day or hour. As in the East London slums of Whitechapel, women worked from shared apartments, their office a thin mattress on the floor, often with little more than a tattered sheet as divider. The space, no parlor, no welcome, just a hallway with doors to despair. Some of the rooms didn't even have proper bedding, just straw mats or fraying blankets. There were broken chairs, broken windows, and rats. In one of the worst cases, women worked from derelict buildings, cellars, or courtyard shanties, completely at the mercy of the elements and predators. Hygiene. There was none. If water was on hand, it was pumped from a shared pump. The communal outhouse, usually in a disgusting condition, was also a hotbed of cholera and dysentery. The odor alone would repel even the most desperate of customers. Yet these rooms were full. The poor continued to seek comfort, even momentary, and the women, with no options, continued on. Though the nature of various houses of ill repute was varied, some decorations and services were standard. Mirrors, wall-to-wall mirrors, were as symbolic as they were practical. They catered to vanity and let clients look through all around. Chamber pots. No one used the bathroom indoors. Waste was quietly disposed of at times into street drains. Water closets and towels, an encouraging hygiene outfit, shared often, unwashed. Hot water was available upon request in wealthier households. Candles and lamps. Light candles improvised the mood. Red glass lampshades or low candlelight blurred imperfections and added illusion. Locks and bolts. Quite a few rooms had neither, especially in second-rate brothels. Women were at the mercy of invasion at all hours. It was always sensory overload in a brothel, by design, irresistibly so or stunningly so. In high-end houses the air was filled with music, from live or automated music boxes. Lavender, musk, and rosewater perfumed many of the recipes. The air was warm, occasionally muggy, heavy with perfume and tobacco. In low-end brothels, inside, the sounds were severe: grunting, crying, footsteps, slamming doors. Smells included body odor and alcohol, mildew, blood, and rot. Candles sputtered. Mice rustled in corners. Every creak meant danger. This realm has always been the clearest contrast of appearance and reality. The ceiling might be knocking on the floor, and a velvet curtain covering a cracked wall. A giggling girl might be crying on the inside. It wasn't just that architecture did something. It had the power to shape people's behavior. Design in parlor houses made for theater. Women swept grand staircases like actresses. Clients took the roles of gentlemen and rakes. Rooms were scenes in a play, and each encounter rehearsed 1,000 times. Some houses of ill repute even had secret doors and escape routes, tunnels, or back stairs, slips out of which were made when the police raided or scandal threatened. Some had viewing rooms with one-way curtains that clients could watch through before selecting. These aspects were a manifestation of the paranoia, subterfuge, and power politics inherent in the business. The madam's room would be near the entrance, or perhaps on a middle floor. From her perch, she saw everything: who came and went, who made what, and who caused problems. Her room might include a ledger booklock box for earnings, a little arm or club defense spare, cosmetics or linens, small shrine, religious idol or picture. She ran the house as if it were a military operation. Some rang bells or blew whistles to summon girls. Others maintained order with fines or evictions. The building was her empire. Brothels constantly faced danger from the police, from dissatisfied clients, from vigilante mobs. How they were constructed was a matter of life and death. Escape routes were vital. Many houses had trapdoors to cellars, back exits into alleyways, adjacent rooftops for climbing when raids struck. Women had seconds to go into hiding. Rooms had concealed compartments, or could be entered only through wardrobe doors or beneath staircases. Yet architecture could also trap. Girls were often locked in at night in some centers, or denied entry to main gates. Fire safety was non-existent. Records exist of women dying in brothel fires after being unable to escape from barred windows. There are very few Victorian brothels still standing today. The vast majority were demolished, their function repurposed, their very existence forgotten. But there are vivid pictures in historical records, police reports, architectural sketches, reformers' journals. A structure in Soho that was once filled with the laughter and tears of many people, now an office. A Whitechapel wall that was formerly smeared with blood and lipstick now stands clean of marks behind a coffee shop. Sometimes in the renovations, a landlord will come across a false wall or a stash of old perfume bottles or initials carved into a bedpost. Silent ghosts of the women who'd lived and worked there. These are just a damn sight better, of course. Many brothels could still be lurking behind any anonymous door. Even in the most modern city, Victorian brothel bills looked the same as everyone, and their architecture mirrored them. A smooth surface that hid moral rot. Rooms set up for production, not relaxation. Barriers between classes and genders. Escape hatches built into a system that pretended to not exist. Each was a microcosm of the world outside. The severity of rules, the concealment of desire, the clash of wealth and poverty within a single staircase. Victorian brothel women were formed by their spaces, and in turn helped shape them. Every wall bore witness. Every floorboard creaked beneath secrets. The architecture of these places was not neutral. It exerted power, facilitated intimacy, and circumscribed every decision that took place within it. And as we move on from the empty rooms, we let the echoes follow us. It was the unseen killer, the slow devouring fire from the inside, the uninvited guest that walked in on the arm of each client and left, few unmarked. This was the most lethal danger for sex workers in Victorian times, and is the one we address. In this chapter, While Victorian England fought its moral war on prostitution, the actual war was taking place within bodies ravaged by infection, treated with poison, buried in silence. This is the tale of the Red Plague. Victorian England's brothels, particularly in cities such as London, Manchester and Liverpool, provided the perfect breeding ground for disease. Several factors made this inevitable. Overcrowding. A number of brothels crammed several workers into tight quarters, and potential exposure to clients from all hours of the day and night. Lack of hygiene. There was no clean water. Towels, linen, and wash basins were not sterilized between uses. No protection. Condoms were in existence, but rare, expensive, and not in great demand from clients. Exposure to everyone. A single woman can have 5 to 15 clients in a day. Multiply that by a week, and the count of brothels in a city, and what you have is an overwhelming network of properly physical contact. Mix all that with a society that didn't speak frankly about sex or women's health, and the outcome was predictable. Epidemic-grade infection. The most dreaded disease within the Victorian brothel was syphilis, known by countless names at the time. The Great Pox, the French disease, Cupid's curse. It came in stages. First stage, a small, painless sore, a chancre on the genitals, mouth, or rectum. Stage 2, rashes, fever, enlarged lymph glands, mucus patches. Latent stage, a false sense of security. May go on for years. Upon emergence, wastefulness, helplessness, pacifism, weakness in extremities, damage to brain, tongue and lung that causes lung to explode from body when damaged. Third stage, raving mad, full body paralysis, complete blindness, internal damage, monstrous skin and bone growths. Before long, many women working in brothels became syphilitic. Many lived with the disease for leaders, others died fast. The illness was an equal opportunity disease. It afflicted both the young and old, the poor and the wealthy. Without modern antibiotics, treatments did not work, and they would frequently prove to be deadly. Compared with today, the medical science of the Victorian era was pretty rough. For syphilis, mercury was the treatment of choice, applied through ointments, pills, steam baths and injections. The saying went, a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. Unfortunately, mercury poisoning caused loss of teeth, failure, neurological damage, death, but as risky as it was, desperate women presented themselves for treatment, frequently in lock hospitals, places where women who appeared to have a venereal disease could be locked up on mere suspicion. These were more prisons than hospitals. Patients were restrained, disciplined, examined with invasive objects. Recovery was unlikely, less lethal than syphilis, but much more widespread and equally catastrophic. Symptoms in women included burning urination, pelvic pain, discharge, chronic inflammation if left untreated. It could cause pelvic inflammatory disease, infertility, and sometimes sepsis. Most of the sex workers didn't know they had it. Victorian-era doctors thought incorrectly that infections caused women less pain as well. Therefore, symptoms were left unnoticed till it became late. With repeated exposure, chronic disease resulted. Some women experienced chronic pain and operated out of sheer necessity. Disease wasn't the only danger. Undesirable pregnancy was a continually threat. Most of the prostitutes got pregnant at least once, and some of them many times, because brothels did not offer mothering. Having a baby seemed being thrown onto the street and ceiling. The pregnancy and laboring until the last possible moment abortions were illegal and dangerous. Methods included ingesting toxic herbs, items that are inserted such as knitting needles, overdosing on laudanum, an opiate, seeking assistance from unskilled midwives or street dealers. Many of these women died of infection or blood loss. Others recovered, although they were permanently disabled. There was no post-care, no mourning, one of many names that fade into oblivion. For the sex worker who kept her child, the situation was impossible. Children were barred from most brothels. She said clients didn't want to hear crying in the next room. Some mothers attempted to hold down jobs while caring for their infants, stashing them out of sight during the day or paying neighbors to keep an eye on them. Others resorted to baby farms, unregulated private homes that accepted unwanted infants for a fee. These were places where abuse, starvation, and even murder were common. Children often died within weeks. One notorious baby farmer, Amelia Dyer, is believed to have killed more than 200 babies in her care before she was hanged in 1896. A mother could come back to collect her child to hear they didn't make it, with no explanation and no accountability. Nina read more on Stop Asian Hate United States. There are so many lying dead and suddenly gone from our world. Phil Choi, one of the first 10 Chinese American to die is coronavirus. In the 1860s, Britain enacted these laws, called the Contagious Diseases Acts. These were designed to prevent the spread of venereal disease, especially amongst troops posted in garrison towns. The reality: suspected prostitutes were subject to being stopped on the street, arrested without trial, and given a gynecological examination. If they were found to be suffering from the disease, they could be forcibly detained in a lock hospital for a maximum, or 3 months later increased to 1 year. Men, whether customers, soldiers, and yes, even some of those who committed the rapes themselves, were not investigated or punished. These acts institutionalized sexual inequality. They medicalized shame. The upshot was to permit the state to treat female bodies as public property. Outrage grew. Rape law reformers, including Josephine Butler, a leading campaigner for women's rights, mobilized a national movement for repeal. They also contended that the laws had served to criminalize poverty and female sexuality, and not disease. Finally, after years of protest, the acts were repealed in 1886, but the legacy remained: the shame they codified, the lives they ruined. Madams were riding the line between infamy and convenience. Victorian society shunned, infuriatedly scolded, really them publicly. However, many of these madams held very strong local influence. They paid their rent or mortgage on time. They paid into the coffers of local police bribes. They brought business to shops nearby: clothing, food, liquor. They held public order by regulating the behavior of clients and workers within their walls. Many were, in consequence, essentially abandoned, particularly in neighborhoods where sex work was openly tolerated. Others even masqueraded as reputable boarding house mistresses or dressmakers on official documents. Discreetly, however, their true power was widely appreciated. Police corruption was rampant. Madams often provided regular fines to local constables to keep the sex workers out of raids. In exchange, police looked the other way to underage workers, unlicensed alcohol, violence. But this arrangement was precarious. If political winds shifted, or reformers aroused public indignation, a madam could be raided, arrested, and closed down overnight. To protect themselves, some madams maintained extensive financial and personal records on local politicians. Police and judges established relationships with newspapers to suppress scandals. Blackmail, threatening to expose the identities of clients if convicted. In this way, madams held not money, but knowledge, a much stronger form of currency in Victorian culture. While most madams are unidentified in the documents, a handful of names do emerge. Mary Jeffreys London, among the most notorious of the madams of London's West End. She counted aristocrats, politicians, and foreign dignitaries among her clients. In her brothel, themed rooms and imported luxuries were the norm. She was arrested, at last, after a high-profile scandal with underage girls, but never really went to prison. There are rumors that she kept a little black book of her clients. Sarah Potter Liverpool operated a mid-tier brothel with a military clientele. She was said to have protected her girls fiercely, dispensed rudimentary medical care, and paid funeral costs if they were killed. Locally feared and respected, Madame Violet Manchester, an ex-prostitute who became the owner of a lucrative chain of brothels throughout the north of England. She was most famous for inventing the half-hour parlor format: faster turnaround, bigger profits, brutal but effective. Those women were in it to represent vice, and yet display how power can be clawed from the impossible. The truth is complicated. Some of these madams were like mothers, providing protection and structure, and even affection. They kept violent clients out, dispensed medicine, and served as mentors for new workers. Girls referred to them as auntie or ma. All these had their victims, as well as their monsters and exploiters, more interested in profit than people. They ensnared women in debt, manipulated them, or ignored violence. Most were both. They were part of their times and their things. In a world that didn't give women much power of any sort, they took control, including the option to control others. Big-time madams didn't just restrict themselves to one house. Some operated networks of brothels, one house for upper-class clients, one more for sailors or workingmen, another discreet apartment for rich married regulars. They rotated workers. They took care of inventory, bed linens, makeup, alcohol. They also developed brand reputations. Customers knew which house had music, which house had opium, and which house had the prettiest girls. These women employed staff, cooks, cleaners, lookouts, even entertainers. Some of them had bodyguards or lawyers. Not in all ways, they were CEOs of the underworld. Madame X's golden age, it was the last hurrah of the Victorian moral reform movements. Intensified. Police corruption faced growing scrutiny. The new laws increased punishment for keepers of disorderly houses. Public fury over trafficking and child exploitation erupted in the wake of scandals. By 1900, most brothels had been driven underground or closed altogether. Some madames fled the country. Still others recast themselves as boarding house keepers, matchmakers, or fortune-tellers. The emergence of newer, more impersonal kinds of sex work, street walking, and the escort system also made the traditional madame less central. Yet for years, they had run a hidden empire. Victorian historians often ignored madames, or worse, painted them as monstrous villains or cartoonish hags. But modern scholarship tells a much more complicated story. Madames were strong women in a men-dominated society business, innovators, survivors of trauma, occasionally abusers themselves. Economic urban centers, vital figures in the urban econom 33, had such influences they dealt in a moral grey area, but they did so with cunning, intelligence, and profound insight into human behavior. Their lives defy easy judgment. The Victorian madame led a queen without a court. Her kingdom was delicate, shielded by lace curtains and heavy locks, a desk for a throne, a ledger book for a scepter. She was, as it were, hated and needed, envied and feared. But, most of all, she was in charge of her business and her image and her fate. For as long as this city allowed her to. When the doors to the brothel finally closed behind her, there was no statue, no plaque, just whispers, and a name which not even men dare speak at the light of day. Every brothel had its curtain, one man with a wallet, a secret, and 1,000 rationalizations. He might be a factory worker, or a lord, a priest, or a poet. He had come for pleasure, for power, for pain, or for motives he had never clearly understood. In this chapter, we keep the clients of Victorian brothels in the spotlight, who they were, what they wanted, and how they shaped the economy of desire. This is not only a tale of women selling sex, but of the men who bought it. The prostitute is often a name in history, and the patron, not so much. Victorian courts, newspapers, and reformers branded women as fallen, loose, or immoral. Men were scarcely given names, or blamed. Why? Upper-class men benefited from class privilege, which shielded them from public scandal. Male sexual needs were natural under patriarchy. Female sexuality was policed or condemned. Religion and the law targeted women as the root cause, not men as sinners. But there would be no system without clients. And so, we have to want to know, who were these men? Brothels catered for a wide cross-section of the community, with clients ranged along the class, area and cost spectrums. Upper-class clients. These consisted of peers, MPs, judges, barristers, military officers, and rich merchants. They went to upmarket parlour houses in Mayfair or Bloomsbury. They sought discretion. Their reputations were fragile. Exotic decor, role-play, filmatic, showy foreplay, Ursal fantasy, ordinal 3-3, exclusivity. Some paid, in addition to keep a woman, for rent of her time for days. Some upper-class men treated brothels like social clubs, bringing friends along, smoking, cigars, talking politics. Middle-class clients. Mid-tier brothels were staffed, in part by clerks, shopkeepers, journalists, and professional tradesmen. These men had moderate incomes, but little public authority. Brothels offered escape and dominance. They typically visited once or twice a week. Paid moderate fees formed attachments to specific women. Saw the visit as a treat or relief from stress. Work. Client stock workers, porters, soldiers, chimney sweeps, and factory workers all visited inexpensive brothels or vied for favors on the streets. In a shared room or a dark alley, a quick transaction was all they could afford. For them, sex was brief, anonymous, often dangerous, occasionally exchanged for food or drink, rather than money, precisely because of their budget constraint. These customers were the main source of business. Sex was just part of the transaction. Men visited brothels for a huge variety of emotional, psychological reasons. Power and controlsome were looking for power in a world where they felt bereft of power elsewhere. It would have been the other way around in a brothel. They were in control. Companionship. Victorian cities were places of epidemic loneliness. In brothels, men who were short of a wife, family, or standing in society could experience a sort of transient intimacy, there being someone to chat to be affectionate with, and kind. Curiosity brothels frequently played host to young men, either students or recent immigrants. Some were started by peers or even family members. Fetish and fantasy. Some clients had desires that society considered taboo: bondage, cross-dressing, submission, age play. Many brothels advertised themed rooms or women who were open to role play: nurse, nun, governess, maid. Emotional escape. A man with debt or shame or grief might spend the little he had in a brothel, not for sex, but for forgetfulness. Others simply sat and drank, chatting with the women for hours. Numerous men attached themselves to particular women. These were the regulars or keepers. A keeper who paid a regular fee to reserve a woman's time, sometimes to the exclusion of others. He might give her gifts or rent money, visit her at fixed times, anticipate fidelity though seldom returning the favor, become emotionally possessive, even violent. Some thought of their kept woman as a mistress. Others saw her as property. Those relationships might be healthy or toxic. In some cases, women turned to their keepers for protection or money, but many ended up stuck, abused, or even killed when they sought to escape. Many clients were married, a fact that might surprise viewers today. And there were, in fact, a lot of men who frequented the brothels who had wives, who had children. Why? In Victorian times, marriages were not characterized by emotional happiness or sexual satisfaction. Wives were supposed to be pure, not passionate. Sex was only for having babies, not enjoyment. Women were often pregnant or postpartum, stifling intimacy. Husbands rationalized a visit to an extramarital visit as biological necessity. This hypocrisy was widely known but seldom spoken. The brothel served as the unspoken safety valve for an institution of double standards. Not all customers came in peace. Women feared drunken men who became violent, those sadists whose pleasure it was to inflict pain, robbers who wouldn't pay and simply stole what they wanted, the madmen, men in distraction, in paranoia, in breakdown with few legal protections. Madams or other workers frequently physically defended one another. Some brothels hired male guards or muscle precisely for this reason. Others had codes or bells, rings or knocks that indicated distress. A rape victim, or even a woman who had simply been beaten. An assault, typically called in South Africa a common assault, which does not result in serious injury, might be called a prostitute. It was not a society that mourned fallen women. Victorian literature and theatre tended to romanticize the brothel client. In novels or plays, the client was misbegotten, noble, a lost soul. He saved the whore from her vice. They fell in love. She became respectable. He was redeemed. But reality was harsher. The majority of clients didn't want to save women. They'd wanted them to be local, not in a different town, and available, compliant, temporary. Yet a few love stories did surface. Some of these women married patrons and exited the business. But many of these marriages foundered, plagued by stigma, jealousy, and money woes. Victorian money is complicated, but here's an amateur's guide. Streetwalker, 3 to 6 pence. Low brothel, 1 to 2 shillings. 12 to 24 pence. Mid-tier brothel, 510 shillings. Parlour house, upper end, 1 to 2 guineas. A guinea was worth 21 shillings too. Compare 15 to 20 shillings, or what a working class man could make in a week. A middle class clerk would be on from 100 to 150 shillings a week. This in effect made a visit to a brothel an occasional luxury for poor men, a part of daily life for the middle class, and a regular expense for the rich. Brothel records indicate they paid in advance, on credit, or even with stolen goods. Some pawned personal belongings to finance visits. The man who visited the Victorian brothel represented several contradictions of his time: repression and indulgence, public virtue and private vice, moral preaching and secret pleasure. He was the driver of the brothel economy, yet he did not want to be seen. He required female availability while insisting on female modesty. He sneered at sex workers during the day, then he ran to their arms at night. His mere existence reveals the rank hypocrisy of the era. Prostitutes were criticized, but not the men who'd made them necessary, she wrote. It was rare, but some clients did get exposed, often with scandalous results. The Cleveland Street Scandal, 1889, in London. Police raided a male brothel and exposed a network of clients that included aristocrats, civil servants, and possibly Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson. The government suppressed it, but the press lit up with conjecture. Police logs and John books and madams kept hidden ledgers that included client names, preferences, and blackmail material. These books occasionally turned up in raids of brothels and destroyed careers or marriages. For a man that was taken on, 100 got away. But these occasional scandals reveal the extent to which the brothel was built into the very institutions that condemned it. By the late 19th century, a world that the brothel client knew began to vanish. Brothel visits were made riskier by moral reformers. Police enforcement intensified. Medical fear of syphilis and gonorrhea, in particular, increased. With sexual norms in flux, courtship became more conservative. The urban anonymity allowed for more furtive, autonomous sex work. Brothels of the type known today had replaced earlier makeshift brothels. For example, those attached to inns. The client remained but changed shape. Now he is not a gentleman with a calling card, but a shadow. The Victorian brothel user was not an exception. He represented every man, banker, soldier, clerk, preacher. His depravities, his hypocrisy, and his silence were not single failures. They were part of the world he inhabited. To understand the brothel, we have to understand the buyer, not only the seller. And to comprehend him is to face an uncomfortable truth. Shadows didn't just shroud the women. In the Victorian imagination, the country was the land of innocence, a place of green fields and moral clarity and wholesome simplicity. But behind the hedges and down the winding roads, the world was not so pure. Sex work did not reside only in the slums of London or the foggy alleys of Manchester. It was here, too subtle, adaptable, and hiding in plain sight. This chapter brings to life a much quieter yet in some ways equally complicated world. Rural brothels, and the women, men, and communities that protected them. City brothels could be relatively localized in red light districts, but rural ones were more widespread, more clandestine, and often more malign. It was a tag that hardly got affixed in any official record. They appeared as country inns with rooms, to let farmhouses with unusually high traffic, widows or spinners, kept cottages. Canalside taverns and coach stops. The brothel wasn't always even a building. It might be a stretch of hedgerow familiar to local men, a barn at night, or a room above a butcher's shop. What they lacked in structure, they made up for in secretive, and often, community complicit membership. Smaller communities often knew exactly what was going on and looked the other way. Why? Economics. Brothels attracted traveling men, carters, drovers, traders, who spent money at local shops and taverns. Tradition. Some communities viewed sex work as simply the way it is, particularly in close proximity to ports, barracks, fairs, or mining towns. The scandal factor. Ratting out the local whorehouse is to possibly declare to a town that includes husbands, sons, and landowners, "You're trying the church." Protection. Sometimes the madam or brothel keeper had connections to the church, constabulary, or landowners. And so, in the rural brothel, silence became the coin that paid for survival. There were many kinds of rural sex work, and they were as diverse as they were influenced by environment and opportunity. The village parlor, house operated by a local lady and or retired prostitute. Small brothel with between 2 to 5 women for clients. They served farmers, soldiers, and the occasional tourist. They often posed as boarding houses or tea rooms, working quietly for years. The pub brothel. Some of the working girls even frequent taverns near rural crossroads or around canal routes. A person could take a drink, rent a room, and be on the go in an hour. Some female employees were paid in food or lodging, as opposed to wages. Exploitation was common. Agricultural exchange. That's when seasonal sex work became the norm. Demand was generated by itinerant male predominantly workforces. Women would migrate to these regions for seasonal labor. Sometimes sex was traded for grain, meat, or lodging instead of money. On large estates, lonely gamekeepers, stewards, or groundsmen would keep mistresses or pay for women on the quiet. Such arrangements were nowhere accepted, openly or without embarrassment. Not all rural sex workers were traditional prostitutes. Many of them were part-time or seasonal workers, and most were extremely isolated. They included widows with no income, the poor farmers' daughters, hunting for dowries, and freedom single mothers disowned by their family, drunken or absent husbands, wives dismissed, domestic servants after pregnancy, and like city prostitutes, rural ones had no madam, no protection, and not even a network for support. They worked alone or in pairs, living on local gossip. Anonymity was their armor, but also their downfall. Men visited rural brothels from across, traveling salesmen and traders, soldiers from country garrisons, farmhands and drovers, gentlemen touring their estates, clergy and school teachers behind closed doors in some rural counties. Upper-class men would keep local girls in hushed cottages, giving them money or goods in return for sexual access. These arrangements were often exploitative, but they were rarely prosecuted. It was difficult to enforce morality in the countryside. Rural police forces were small, and often had little budget, meaning they might feel pressured to turn a blind eye to such private matters. To investigate a brothel was to interrogate upstanding men, some of them the magistrates who would sit in judgment on the case. Even when there were investigations, the investigations faced obstacles: witness silencing, cooperative landowners, vanishing suspects, community backlash rather than arrests. Police tended to warn women or move them on by force removal orders. They were called. Women were shuttled from parish to parish like baggage, with no legal rights or a place to call home. But even in secrecy, rural sex work was not free of a wave of morality that washed over Victorian England. Evangelical reformers conducted campaigns in the villages, employing pamphlets on the dangers of sin and disease, mission houses to save fallen women's sermons, targeting known brothel keepers, pressure on landlords to throw out suspected prostitutes. But the results were mixed. In other cases, women were reformed. In some, they were merely relocated, traipsing from one village to the next, casting shadows and causing whispers. Such exposure was more difficult in the anonymous city brothel than in rural sex work, which frequently culminated in scandal and public humiliation. Sample 1. The parson and the innkeeper's DAUGHTR. Back in 1874, a parson in Gloucestershire was discovered to be washing his feet in a local inn's back room several times a week. When the girl got pregnant, he claimed none of it was true. A local pamphlet war ensued. Example 2. The squire's concubine, young woman in Yorkshire, was discovered in a gamekeeper's cottage on the property of a squire who had a wife. After her body was found in a nearby stream, the village divided: suicide or murder. These stories were whispered among relatives with the hushed tones of local folklore, but seldom appeared in the national press. The country took care of its own, until it didn't. The country bordello was not spared. The terrors of its city cousins. Disease was more difficult to treat because of absent doctors, scanty access to medicine, and still greater shame in small communities. Women died quietly, alone. There were no lock hospitals, no nurse reformers, no relief clinics. Similarly, violence often went unpunished. If a woman was beaten or raped, she had great difficulty proving it or getting help. Some sought abortions from herbalists or wise women. The rest depended on painful folk remedies or dangerous isolation. Many rural prostitutes had children. Some were produced in hiding. Others were passed to baby farmers, distant relatives, orphanages run by churches for these children. There was often lifelong stigma. A girl, for example, could be branded a hedged child, a nasty nickname for a child born out of wedlock to a known prostitute. And many of these women defied fierce odds to raise their children, working on harvests, sewing, cleaning through the day and seeing clients at night. They were survivors, too, not merely sinners. By the turn of the century, rural brothels were fading for various reasons. Moral pressure intensified, transport links improved. Men could travel to towns more readily. Urban work migration increased, police forces expanded, legislative changes rendered disorderly houses more unambiguously criminal, but traces persist in oral histories, in barely legible police logs, in the half-burned diaries of country girls who once took that dare. The country was not a refuge from plough and prayer, only it was a world of secrets, survival and sensuality. Women farmed the fields and worked behind the doors. They were visited by their clients on horseback, in carts, and on foot. The story of their lives was not composed in history books, but in silence, there was a house behind the hedge. In that house, a woman waited, not for love, not even for sin, but for the next hour's coin, the next day's bread, the next prospect of a life beyond the field. Deep in the silence of London's night, when brothels buzzed with furred conspiracy and candlelit secrets, another world moved stealthily across town at the police station, in the courtroom, in the secret rooms of power. This was no simple war on prostitution. It was a war of optics, allegiances, and interests. It was a war not, at all times, waged around a principle of morality, but of control. In this chapter, we reveal the labyrinthine relationship between the Victorian brothel and the law where justice was blind and virtue was frequently up for sale. The Victorian police force was relatively in its infancy in the mid-19th century. Founded in 1829, the Metropolitan Police Force expanded over the years, but its interactions with brothels were complex. A. Corruption and collusion. A well-known fact among many officers accepted payoffs from madames to look away at their operations got paid in sex instead of money. The following was his charge. Tipped brothels off about raids that were set to occur. Frequented brothels themselves in working-class areas. Certain homes had made arrangements with police stations. They were saved no ordeal by peace. B. Moralists versus pragmatists. Not all officers were corrupt. For a few, brothels were genuinely perceived as immoral menaces. These men sought raids and closures, public exposure of offenders, the need to police morality, and very especially women's dress and behavior, but they collided with superiors who valued public order over moral purity. Silent brothels were regarded by society as necessary evils, which kept men off the streets. What emerged was a bifurcated force, half moderate enablers and half apostles. Vice squads, whose work focused solely on vice crimes and took form in the large cities such as London, Liverpool, and Manchester, came into existence in the 1860s and 1870s. Their responsibilities were defined and contained prostitution-related crime. Their methods included undercover operations, sting setups, following suspected clients, surveilling known brothel street stir, trapping, particularly in respect to alleged gay brothels. But these detachments were often steeped in controversy. Criticisms included invasive tactics violating civil liberties, Jardwet Taffel Thelks Carlsbad, targeting the poor and ignoring upper-class brothels, females being bullied only because of the words of the mouth and facial appearance, padding of charges to make up quotas. Some newspapers likened the squads to secret police forces, accusing them of intimidating people into silence, particularly vulnerable women. The brothel cases that went before a court produced wildly different outcomes, depending on the class of the accused, the reputation of the brothel, the presence of respectable witnesses, public interest in the case. Level brothel workers, fined small sums or jailed for a few days. Common prostitute, vagrant, disorderly, personally given legal counsel. Shamed publicly in newspapers, madames fined or imprisoned for not more than 6 months. Properties, sometimes confiscated, sometimes acquitted, when the case was weak or neighbors would not come forth. Clients never prosecuted, and when it appears in court records, even if caught in the act, sheltered by immunity or a woman willing to testify. Notable double standards in cases where a brothel was connected to a politician or an aristocrat. Charges were dropped quietly, records were sealed, or women were sent away. And perhaps the most notorious legal intervention in Victorian sex work was the Contagious Diseases Acts, CD Acts, laws aimed at controlling the spread of venereal diseases, especially in connection with the military. Under these laws, Dr. Sarah, female soldiers could be submitted to genital exams if they were suspected of prostitution in garrison towns. If infected, they could be placed in a hospital for up to a year. Failure to toe the line ensured arrest and imprisonment. The catch: only women were targeted. It was just the men, the spreaders of the diseases, who were not subject to the same types of inspections, restrictions, or consequences. This action provoked a huge backlash, especially from JP, the Ladies' National Association, under Josephine Butler. Religious groups, liberal reformers. In 1886, following many years of protest, the acts were at last repealed. Victorian society was policed not only by the police but by citizens themselves. In particular, evangelical groups, women's Caritas, middle-class reformers, moral hygiene leagues. These groups reported brothels to the press, demanded stricter laws, shamed Police Foreign Action attempted to rescue women through missions and shelters, but they were not blameless either. Criticisms included the women as submissive victims, needing to be controlled, ignoring clients, entirely prioritizing conversion over compassionately employing, rescued women as instruments of fundraising or public morality, crusades, yet they had pressured the parliament to act and influenced how people would debate the brothels for decades. That wasn't everyone's position in the legal world, though. Most helped them to survive for a fee. Lawyers some defended madams regularly. They taught them legal loopholes, how to rent buildings using fake names, how to rotate workers to prevent disorderly house allegations, how to silently pay the right people. Landlords some leased buildings to known brothels at sky-high rents. If there was a raid, they said they didn't know. Informants so did police officers and madams. One might grass on a competing brothel, provide names of abusive clients, spying on reformers to keep a step ahead of public campaigns. Information was currency, and in the world of law and vice, it passed from hand to hand. A string of brothel-related scandals showed how extensively the legal system was entwined with sex work. The Charles Bravo case, 1876, the poisoning of a rich barrister, was found to frequent several brothels. There were never any charges, but the public gawking reduced his public persona to one of ignominy. The Maiden Tribute to Modern Babylon, 1885. Sensational journalism. W. T. Stead's Maiden Tribute, a sensational Welsh universal newspaper, the Pall Mall Gazette, published an exposé showing that young girls, underage girls, were being sold to London brothels. He even contrived a phony purchase to demonstrate it. The result? Massive moral outrage. Stead is arrested, not ironically at the time. The Traffickers Criminal Law Amendment Act, which increased age of consent to 16 parties. The brothel ceased to be a men's secret. It was now a national crisis. This started changing much more quickly by the end of the 19th century. Professionalization of police brought about more control. A more aggressive crop of journalists uncovered corruption. Public health efforts began to focus on men as vectors of disease. With the rise of urban development, brothels moved to the nearby outskirts of town. Social purity became a popular cause. Caught the ear of politicians. Raids increased. Convictions rose. The only possible survival strategy was discretion. A number of brothels closed down or went underground. The era of the open-door Victorian brothel was coming to a close. Maybe the most tragic irony of any. The system itself, that was ostensibly to contain vice, made it, shielded it, and profited from it, until it became politically inconvenient. They bore the brunt until they couldn't anymore. And this was a world men built, a punishment for surviving in the world men designed, with the expectation that women would have no choice at all. Men were defenseless, who conslaved in this very system. The law was not blind. It looked the other way, until that scandal came knocking. It was never just about moral purity. The legal war against Victorian brothels, it was a matter of order and appearances, and who had the right to break the rules. Brothels didn't endure in spite of the law. They survived because the law was meant to regulate, not end, their presence. It punished women and protected men and kept the machinery turning until moral panic or public disgrace dictated otherwise. In this battle between vice and virtue, little attention was paid to justice, but secrets were always kept. History records numbers, it tallies arrests, coins, addresses, diseases, but it does not often pause for the heartbeats, the sorrows, the laughter, the guilt, the fleeting triumphs that lived inside the bodies of the women it judged. This isn't a chapter on law or commerce. It's about grief and love, hope and shame, longing and loneliness. It's about what it was like to live and survive as a woman in the world of Victorian sex work. These are tales, inscribed not in books but in silk, in scars and in silence. Every working girl had an initiation. Some turned up at brothels already tougher than when they were abused. Others were plucked from sheltered lives facing a sudden fall to earth. For many, the first night was not a choice. It was taken, demanded, or life-saving. The emotional impact was immense. Fear of violence or STD, shame over falling from grace, physical pain and emotional Ouroboros. Because mental escape to suffer what the body needs to stay for. Some women wept alone afterward. Others quickly connected with roommates. Most did not need to learn for long that tears were threatening. They could elicit cruelty, derision, or worse. In order to endure the emotional toll of the work, Women developed coping strategies. Detachment. Many talked about splitting into two selves. One who endured the an onlooker from afar. This mental dividing line allowed them to retain identity, even dignity in excruciating times. Humor. There was a lot of gallows humor in brothels. Clients were ridiculed in their backs. Illnesses were joked to scorn, and ridiculous circumstances laughed at. It wasn't cruelty, it was resistance. Nicknames and personasa. Lot of them changed their names, assumed alter egos. Maggie became Rosa, Jane became Velvet. The fake name shielded the true soul beneath. Some turned into flirtatious vixens, while others were cool queens of irony. Each mask was a shield. When traditional family or community was not available, brothel women cultivated close emotional connections to other brothel women. They shared food when money was tight, secrets and dreams, warnings about dangerous clients' clothing and personal items, childcare, responsibilities if mothers worked. Combined, these friendships were lifelines. A woman's suicide attempt could be prevented because a roommate happened to go in to check on her. In a world where almost every man was a danger, other women were sanctuaries. Naturally, not all relationships were warm. Jealousies arose. Tension developed over competition in regular clients. But in spite of this, a vulnerable web of solidarity usually remained. Was it possible to love in a brothel? Yes and no. Real women sometimes had crushes on customers that were being nice to them. Other women in-house, such as romantic friendships or queer relationships, Madame Brothel owner or Madame Good Ones if they did security. But love was dangerous. It muddied the waters, confused the understanding, and frequently led to heartache. So many women were taught to withhold love, that it was somehow an indulgence they could not afford, and yet many held on to hope of marriage, rescues, or just someone who could see them as something more than a commodity. Thousands of the sex workers were mothers. Others had worked in the trade to provide for their children. Others became pregnant while working. Still others delivered in silence. Without a record, the emotional cost of motherhood in the world of the brothel was overwhelming. A few mothers concealed their children from employers or clients. Others sent them to care homes, where they would be sojourned but over holidays. Some raised their children in the brothel, where other women pitched in to help. What did it feel like? Joy at small milestones, guilt over the environment, fear of police raids, or self-appointed moral conquisitors taking their children away there. Are diary entries from the era that describe women singing lullabies through tears, clutching babies after long nights with strangers. For many women, motherhood, the possibility of children being born from more than one source or a baby appearing miraculously at a door, was the only thing left that could give meaning to their lives. Even women who no longer believed in the church remained marked by it. They'd grown up hearing about damnation and sin and eternity in the fiery furnace. Some absorbed guilt so thoroughly it became a part of their identity. Others fought back, spiritually, lighting candles in secret, praying after clients left, negotiation with God. Let me stay one more year, and then I'll go. Slipping money into the secret envelopes of churches, and still, redemption was elusive. Your church-run missions usually required absolute submission, confession, or harsh rules. Even in charity, some women said they felt judged. Yet for many of them that was a private, defiant faith. God knows what I've gone through. He will understand. Victorian brothel sex work was physically punishing. Women endured 6 to 10 clients per night, and safe abortions, frequent STD like syphilis and gonorrhea, vaginal lacerations, infections, and injuries to the pelvis, sleep deprivation, malnutrition. They looked 10 years older, in their mid-20s, but the emotional wear was far worse. Some referred to themselves as walking ghosts, unable to feel alive, if not quite dead. The act of applying makeup, of smiling, of undressing, of performing, it became a sort of theater that devoured the soul. And yet, they continued, because stopping meant starvation. The things that a Victorian prostitute missed after death, if you asked her, would be a lost child, a sister who died of disease or disappeared, the man who pledged marriage and vanished, the capacity to get a good night's sleep without nightmares. You just get to walk and not be judged. Some women kept trinkets, lockets from home, ribbons from girlhood dresses, letters from mothers they would never see again. They were touchstones for a self they worried might be vanishing. And yet there was joy too. Moments of foot in the door dancing, in the parlor sharing stolen fruit or cigarettes, helping a friend flee from a violent client, seeing The sunrise after playing all night and still being alive. Some women took pleasure in taking back their looks, finding dresses that expressed them, and wearing their choice of makeup. Learning how to read or write in guided lessons from other workers. Plotting an escape by a coin at a time. A new life saved one woman. The following note: they believe we are all broken, but some of us are sharper than glass, and sharper still for what we have survived. Despite all of this shame, trauma, poverty, danger, many women clung to hope. Hope for a new start. Hope for a new start. Hope to fall in love. Hope that someone, somewhere cared about them. Some managed to escape. They ran shops, married, joined reform homes. Others passed away in alleyways or poorhouses. But even behind the broken stories, there was resilience. There was no peace for them in their world. But within that world, many created small sanctuaries, moments of meaning, if not freedom. To treat these women as a statistic or a warning is to ignore the human cost. They were not symbols. They were not either victims or temptresses. They were people, messy, brave, compromised, beautiful in their tenacity. Behind every lace, glove, every powdered cheek, every wink or moan or sigh, there was a woman with a soul, with memories, and I listened with feelings too profound for me to know how they came to be inside me. We call them fallen. But perhaps they merely fell farther than most dared to look, and even there, some of them discovered paths to rise. Not every woman remained, for all the suffering, resistance, and entrapment of the Victorian brothel. Some women escaped, a few managed to escape under the cover of night, some were pushed out, some were rescued, willingly or not, others simply disappeared. It is their stories of escape, recreation, and overcoming that this chapter relates. It's a story about the road out of sex work at a time when forgiveness was rare, second chances rarer, and forgetting nearly impossible. For there is no abrupt process of exit from prostitution for these women. They followed a tipping point, a blow that made bearing unbearable. Common reasons included serious illness or injury, pregnancy, and fear of authorities, and the friend or brother in the brothel dying, any physical assault by a customer or a pimp, a last betrayal, a lover who cleaned out her bank account, or a madam who left her, religious guilt, or moral awakenings, seeking or reclaiming child rearing. Some women also reported experiencing a moment of stark clarity. If I were to spend one more week there, I would die, and so they ran. The journey out of sex work was also dangerous and uncertain. Options were few, risks were many, support was almost non-existent. Running away. Some women escaped on the sly, particularly if they feared their madam or pimp. These women risked retaliation or pursuit, homelessness, arrest as a vagrant or prostitute if seen on the street, but some succeeded. They disappeared into untrammeled towns, assumed new names, and began anew as laundresses, seamstresses, or housekeepers. When traditional family or community was not available, brothel women cultivated close emotional connections to other brothel women. They shared food when money was tight, secrets and dreams, warnings about dangerous clients, clothing, and personal items, childcare, responsibilities if mothers worked. Combined, these friendships were lifelines. A woman's suicide attempt could be prevented because a roommate happened to go in to check on her. In a world where almost every man was a danger, other women were sanctuaries. Naturally, not all relationships were warm. Jealousies arose. Tension developed over competition in regular clients. But in spite of this, a vulnerable web of solidarity usually remained. Was it possible to love in a brothel? Yes and no. Real women sometimes had crushes on customers that were being nice to them. Other women in-house, such as romantic friendships or queer relationships, Madame Brothel owner or Madame Good Ones if they did security. But love was dangerous. It muddied the waters, confused the understanding, and frequently led to heartache. So many women were taught to withhold love, that it was somehow an indulgence they could not afford, and yet many held on to hope of marriage, rescues, or just someone who could see them as something more than a commodity. Thousands of the sex workers were mothers. Others had worked in the trade to provide for their children. Others became pregnant while working. Still others delivered in silence. Without a record, the emotional cost of motherhood in the world of the brothel was overwhelming. A few mothers concealed their children from employers or clients. Others sent them to care homes, where they would be sojourned but over holidays. Some raised their children in the brothel, where other women pitched in to help. What did it feel like? Joy at small milestones, guilt over the environment, fear of police raids, or self-appointed moral conquistadors taking their children away. There are diary entries from the era that describe women singing lullabies through tears, clutching babies after long nights with strangers. For many women, motherhood, the possibility of children being born from more than one source or a baby appearing miraculously at a door, was the only thing left that could give meaning to their lives. Even women who no longer believed in the church remained marked by it. They'd grown up hearing about damnation and sin and eternity in the fiery furnace. Some absorbed guilt so thoroughly it became a part of their identity. Others fought back, spiritually, lighting candles in secret, praying after clients left, negotiation with God. Let me stay one more year, and then I'll go. Slipping money into the secret envelopes of churches, and still, redemption was elusive. Your church-run missions usually required absolute submission, confession, or harsh rules. Even in charity, some women said they felt judged. Yet for many of them that was a private, defiant faith. God knows what I've gone through. He will understand. Victorian brothel sex work was physically punishing. Women endured 6 to 10 clients per night, and safe abortions, frequent STD like syphilis and gonorrhea, vaginal lacerations, infections, and injuries to the pelvis, sleep deprivation, malnutrition. They looked 10 years older, in their mid-20s, but the emotional wear was far worse. Some referred to themselves as walking ghosts, unable to feel alive, if not quite dead. The act of applying makeup, of smiling, of undressing, of performing, it became a sort of theater that devoured the soul. And yet, they continued, because stopping meant starvation. The things that a Victorian prostitute missed after death, if you asked her, would be a lost child, a sister who died of disease or disappeared, the man who pledged marriage and vanished, the capacity to get a good night's sleep without nightmares. You just get to walk and not be judged. Some women kept trinkets, lockets from home, ribbons from girlhood dresses, letters from mothers they would never see again. They were touchstones for a self they worried might be vanishing. And yet there was joy too. Moments of foot in the door dancing, in the parlor sharing stolen fruit or cigarettes, helping a friend flee from a violent client, seeing the sunrise after playing all night and still being alive. Some women took pleasure in taking back their looks, finding dresses that expressed them and wearing their choice of makeup, learning how to read or write in guided lessons from other workers, plotting an escape by a coin at a time. A new life saved one woman. The following note: they believe we are all broken, but some of us are sharper than glass, and sharper still for what we have survived. Despite all of this shame, trauma, poverty, danger, many women clung to hope. Hope for a new start, hope for a new start, hope to fall in love, hope that someone, somewhere cared about them. Some managed to escape. They ran shops, married, joined reform homes. Others passed away in alleyways or poorhouses. But even behind the broken stories, there was resilience. There was no peace for them in their world. But within that world, many created small sanctuaries, moments of meaning, if not freedom. To treat these women as a statistic or a warning is to ignore the human cost. They were not symbols. They were not either victims or temptresses. They were people, messy, brave, compromised, beautiful in their tenacity. Behind every lace, glove, every powdered cheek, every wink or moan or sigh, there was a woman, with a soul, with memories, and I listened with feelings too profound for me to know how they came to be inside me. We call them fallen, but perhaps they merely fell farther than most dared to look, and even there, some of them discovered paths to rise. Not every woman remained, for all the suffering, resistance, and entrapment of the Victorian brothel. Some women escaped. A few managed to escape under the cover of night. Some were pushed out. Some were rescued, willingly or not. Others simply disappeared. It is their stories of escape, recreation, and overcoming that this chapter relates. It's a story about the road out of sex work at a time when forgiveness was rare, second chances rarer, and forgetting nearly impossible. For there is no abrupt process of exit from prostitution for these women. They followed a tipping point, a blow that made bearing unbearable. Common reasons included serious illness or injury, pregnancy, and fear of authorities, and the friend or brother in the brothel dying, any physical assault by a customer or a pimp, a last betrayal, a lover who cleaned out her bank account, or a madam who left her, religious guilt or moral awakenings, seeking or reclaiming child rent. Some women also reported experiencing a moment of stark clarity. If I were to spend one more week there, I would die, and so they ran. The journey out of sex work was also dangerous and uncertain. Options were few, risks were many, support was almost non-existent. Running away. Some women escaped on the sly, particularly if they feared their madam or pimp. These women risked retaliation or pursuit, homelessness, arrest as a vagrant or prostitute if seen on the street, but some succeeded. They disappeared into untrammeled towns, assumed new names, and began anew as laundresses, seamstresses, or housekeepers. To leave the Victorian sex trade wasn't just swapping jobs. It was to fight a war against one's history, to fight poverty, stigma, trauma, institutions that are cruel. Some escaped clean, others escaped burned. Some never made it out. But from Stephen through all who attempted, one thing they shared: the sense that they were owed, in a universe rigged to lock them in place. They discovered weaknesses in the walls, and through those cracks, they ran, not to salvation, maybe, but to something of their own invention. It was a rebellion to remember in itself. The British Empire, over which the sun never set, but neither did the shadows. Wherever red banners fluttered and British ships docked, brothels soon appeared, sometimes openly, sometimes hidden, but always present. The imperial trade in sex was a story of native women, European colonists, and the military men between them, tangled in a web of race, power, commerce, and desire. This is the empire of flesh. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire extended from India to Africa, Southeast Asia to the Caribbean. Military garrisons, trading companies, and colonial administrators radiated out from London, and with them, demand for sex. British authorities commonly defended the existence of brothels by arguing that, just released 4,655,849 troops, morale keeping cards $50.57 at TCND3 boost use, 4655849. Cards keeping morale troops, $50.57 at MTGD3 boost use, 4655849 for troops. Morale keeping $50.57 at read more about Can Grand Maesters also play Cleopatra? The name of the game, a method of preventing venereal disease, necessary evil in male harbors a cultured alternative to rape or chaos. But beneath these justifications lay a much more sinister truth. The proliferation of brothels typically exploited colonized women who had little recourse or protection under imperial dominion. Under British Indian government, prostitution was common in Bombay, Mumbai, Calcutta, Delhi, and near the military cantonments. The cantonment brothels to protect British soldiers. Special brothels were established outside army bases. The women inside these were referred to as shacklers, and all of them were almost always Indian. The logic was disturbing. Native women were considered disposable, nameless, and icily controlled. They were subjected to medical exams to be kept clean, for soldiers. Women did not have a choice. Many were compelled into service by poverty, traffickers, or overt coercion. The Indian contagious diseases acts like their British CD acts. The Indian one concentrated on women near garrisons. They were registered by police, subjected to genital inspections, hospitals, locked into lock hospitals if infected men did not face a law to match it. Such clinics had become known among Indian women as the prisons of shame, and they were afraid of both disease and shaming. Resistance was futile. The vast majority were illiterate, legally invisible, and socially discarded. Mixed race and Eurasian women are further. Complication was added by the Eurasian population, offspring of British men and Indian or local women. These women typically had no social standing and were disproportionately serviced within colonial brothels. Shunned by both native and colonial society, they occupied a liminal space, too British to belong, too native to be accepted. In Hong Kong, under the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, the Japanese established brothels for their troops between 1941 and 1945 as a local type of comfort women's system. A licensing and segregation. Brothels were licensed by race and ethnicity: Chinese brothels for Chinese men, European brothels for white colonials. Brothels began appearing in the early 1900s as a result of regional trafficking. European women in prostitution outside Europe then were a rarity in Asia, and usually considered as exotic luxuries, typically white or Russian runaways. B. The protected woman as an active agent in Hong Kong and Shanghai. British officials and merchants took concubines, such as protected women, the kept women. In keeping with Chinese practices of the time, these contracts muddied the waters of cohabitation, ownership and sexual slavery. A woman had no protection except her patron. When she was thrown out, she was usually made destitute and a social pariah. Wherever the British established outposts and mines in South Africa, Nigeria and Kenya, they brought prostitution policy with them, migrant labor and the sexual economy. A. The development of mining, for example in Kimberley and Johannesburg, led to underground, compartmentalized sex markets along lines of work. Black mine workers were to have native African women brought in or rounded up to cater to them. Colonial officials were serviced by white or native women hired out. Mixed-race brothels were banned or forced into hiding to prevent scandal. Colonial officials often looked the other way, particularly if there was money to be made. In some places, town councils licensed sex workers, putting in place red light districts that fostered corruption and police brutality. B. Disease and eugenics. Racial degeneration was a European obsession, with hardened regulations that, once again, applied only to women in the medical field. Some bordellos had been required to hang cards of cleanliness. There were even suggestions that infected women be sterilized, a chilling foreshadowing of 20th century eugenics. Prostitution was as much a byproduct of plantation collapse as a tool of social coercion. This was the case in Barbados, Jamaica, as in British Guiana, a post-slavery, sexual economies, with the end of slavery in 1833. There were limited options for many former enslaved women. Prostitution was one of the only ways to make cash in a cash-starved system. Colonial elites called the women immoral, but continued to visit them in their rooms. Some brothels were organized by Creole or mixed-race women, which allowed a measure of agency, but always within the confines of systemic racism. B. Penal colonies and coerced sex female convicts in places like Australia and other penal colonies. For example, in addition to the settlement pattern, brothels developed and sex became a currency for women without legal support. Colonial British brothels did not depend only on the local population. A trafficking network started to appear to transfer women across borders. Key routes included Chinese trafficked to Southeast Asia as girls, Japanese women sent to Hong Kong, Singapore and India, European women who wrongly consent to go to South Africa. Vigo to the tale, made up by glances, that we may begin from that point. All the while, Indian women migrated internally between villages and cities and garrison towns. The women were often lured with promises of jobs in factories, tea houses or households, then locked into debt or compelled into service. Empire-wide the same pattern repeated. Voiceless women, poor women forced into brothels to slake imperial appetite. White women in the colonies had a distinctive experience. Some arrived as wives or missionaries. Others got caught up in scandal. British fallen women were sometimes sent to the colonies under the pretext of being married off or placed in employment. European whores in colonies were considered too more culpable than local women doing the same thing. As they were disgracing the crown, some became madams, operating top-flight houses for colonial officials, but the stigma remained, and when these women were found, they were shipped away, deported, or left behind, frequently in even more dangerous places than before. Occasionally, resistance did materialize, and native women in India and Burma, local women's groups started to protest against the militarization of prostitution. Petitions were written to colonial offices, objecting to lock hospitals and genital examinations. B. European reformers abroad. Certain Christian missionaries tried to save local prostitutes, but their efforts had an air of colonialism, more an exercise in conversion than liberation. Nonetheless, some did manage to construct shelters, schools, and clinics that did offer actual survivors an out. C. Women who fought back. Even in places like Singapore and Calcutta, there are written accounts of women killing abusive clients, burning down brothels, organizing escapes. The perpetrators were brutally punished, but not before they showed a blaze that empire could not extinguish. The British Empire was not made out of tea, railway lines and conquest. It was constructed upon longing and exploitation, and upon the bodies of women originally never meant to be remembered. The colonial brothel was not merely a venue for sex. It was a site of racial order, economic precarity, and cultural alienation. Their stories are history redeemed, a reminder that beyond the flag, the uniform, the glories, the myths of empire, there were women whose lives were shattered in silence. To venture out as a woman streetwalker in Victorian London was to be seen by dozens of eyes, and seen truly by almost none. You were not just a person, you were a metaphor, a warning, a sin in human skin. This chapter is about the image of the fallen woman, a cultural trope that haunted the pages of novels, sermons, and newspapers for decades. Who created her? Who feared her? And why did 19th century society so desperately need her? In the mid-Victorian public mind, prostitution was gripped as an obsession. It was referred to as the great social evil, a veritable cancer of Christian civilization, a sin that is a necessity and must be handled but never seen. This anxiety extended beyond sex. It touched fears about the urban poor, the collapse of the family, the decline of national virtue, the menace of women in their modern roles. Prostitutes were portrayed as moral disasters as well as public dangers, a walking, breathing embodiment of everything the Victorians dreaded about modernity. The fallen woman was any woman who engaged in sex outside of marriage, but it was most often associated with prostitutes. Traits of the archetype included a woman with purity who lost it passive suffering, sometimes even going as far to not rebellion, a tragic past, poor, seduced, abandoned, a wish to atone by suffering or death. This was not the life of most sex workers, who tended to be complex, strong, and worldly. But what the Victorian press preferred was women who were either angels seeking salvation, or demons dragging men into ruin, scant space for humanity in between. Victorian novels were obsessed with the prostitute, but they could never call her by name, a Charles Dickens sympathy and sentiment. Dickens himself tended to portray ruined women with tragic compassion. Oliver Twist's Nancy is the hooker who looks out for Oliver but is killed for her kindness. Martha Endell of David Copperfield is a ruined woman, Quinwo scandalized and silenced her, who walks the banks of the Thames. These are passive, sad, lumpish women who often die to redeem themselves. Dickens never depicted either the one or the other as surviving, much less flourishing. B. Thomas Hardy, Destruction in Womanhood, Dintess of the D'Urbervilles. Hardy investigates sexual exploitation and hypocrisy. Tess is not exactly a prostitute, but her fall is what would make her socially damned. What shocked Victorian readers was not the fact that Tess is raped, but rather Hardy's sympathy for her in the book's wake. See George Eliot and Elizabeth Gaskell, The Quiet Subversion. His female authors brought to life morally complex, nuanced women who pushed the edges of societal mores but were not always punished for it. Yet their fallen characters rarely enjoyed happy endings. In Victorian paintings, the fallen woman was often a character in melodrama or Christian imagery. Common visual motifs included women in short white nightgowns weeping in alleys, crosses, or Bibles nearby, veils to hint of mystery and vanished innocence. Men leave and woman down. Artists such as George Frederick Watts, Augustus Egg, and Luke Fieldus depicted situations where the woman's sin was plain to see, but her voice was not. She was to be observed, lamented, and moralized about, not fathomed. The prostitute was a scene on stage. Plays such as The Streets of London and The Ticket of Live Man portrayed fallen women as tragic heroines, seduced into perdition but rescued in the final act by a good-hearted man, or The Practice of Religion. Audiences wept, then they applauded. Her suffering proved their virtue, but these representations only solidified a major cultural premise, that a woman's sexuality, expressed outside wedlock, only pointed to ruin. No room was left for sex workers not asking for forgiveness. Victorian newspapers teemed with accounts of murdered prostitutes, especially after the killings attributed to Jack the Ripper in 1888. Yet even in death, these women were counted at fault. Headlines read, "Another fallen woman slain in the EAST end. She had left the paths of virtue, now she lies cold." Whitechapel Vice claims another life, and the coverage was at once titillating yet condemning. These were women who were both spectacle and cautionary tale. Their fatalities were instrumental in justifying increased policing of poor areas, surveillance of working-class women, public funds for additional lock hospitals and asylums. Charities and churches threw themselves into the effort to save prostitutes. Their methods included Magdalene asylums, generally austere, prison-like residential homes for Reformation moral literature, pamphlets entitled with names like The Wages of Sin, public testimonials. Women were required to confess, repent, and Some sincerely did help women flee abusive contracts. Many replaced exploitation with control. A reformed prostitute shall be silent, grateful morally, reborn expressing anger, or sexuality, or independence, meant that they weren't really saved. With the advance of the Victorian era, science started to medicalize morality. Prostitution was now defined with the terms degeneration, female, hysteria, moral insanity. Physicians alleged that the women who sold sex were naturally deviant, addicted to vice, physically distinct from others, with criminal skulls or nervous systems. This pseudoscience served to justify forced medical examinations, institutionalization without consent, eugenics in the form of sterilization or confinement. Prostitute was not only a sinner, she was a sick body to be examined, controlled and cured. Even the real sex workers, the ones who survived or adapted or fought back, seldom appeared in the literary scenarios of the Victorians. They were too inconvenient. They unmasked the hypocrisies of male saviors, not passive victims. They would not stand idly by. They had occasionally reaped profits from the trade and preferred it to famine. They were astute politically, attacking capitalism, patriarchy and hypocrisy. But for Victorian media, they did not fit, because they had survived, and their survival muddied the myth. The myth called for the prostitute to die, or disappear, or repent. What it could not tolerate would be her existence on her own terms. Toward the close of the 19th century, a small but mighty movement started fighting back against the fallen woman, women like campaigners such as Josephine Butler, who successfully fought the contagious diseases, Annie Besant, who published on sexual double standards and class hypocrisy, grassroots women's organizations, underground published memoirs and testimonies, working class women and politics. 329. In underground presses, these voices began to call for the end of forced rescues, advocate for women's rights concerning their work and education, reject the notion that sex reduced a storied dignity. Their stories have largely been erased from the dominant historical narrative, but they laid the groundwork for 20th century feminist movements. To the Victorian people, the prostitute was never a simple woman. She was a mirror, reflecting back society's guilt, fear, and desire. She was used to define good womanhood by contrast. It's okay to oppress in the name of virtue, amuse, arouse, and caution, always against her will. But there were real women underneath the myths and metaphors, with names, with stories, with dreams that didn't finish in alleyways or redemptive narratives. To get at them, we have to strip away the veils, the sermons, the brushstrokes, and hear the voice behind the silent man. For every name we've mentioned in this series, 100 others are gone, forgotten by census records, erased from family trees. Buried by shame and stone and silence, but they were here. This is the chapter for the women who are missing justice, missing graves that name who they are. This is about the reverberations they left behind, and on how they continue to haunt the world in which we live. We've also been studying, for 12 chapters, the reality of Victorian brothel life, but a truth persists after weeks spent rooting around archives, journals, court records, and reformer accounts. There are very few of their stories left. This absence isn't accidental. It was created, maintained by those who didn't write down their names, called them only a girl, a harlot, a body, believed they weren't worth remembering, viewed them as shameful footnotes, not fellow human beings, or, as the historian Judith Walkowitz has said, the prostitute of Victorian England is ever present and unknowable. Our job now is to fill that gap, to know that which was made unknown. It is perhaps possible to ask, why does this history matter? Because the silence is never in the past. It bleeds into the present, in our laws, in our stigmas, in our language. Victorian ideas still influence how we judge sex workers now, the good, the bad, and women, the way victims are questioned in the courtroom, how public discourse polices morality. Poverty is still criminalized. Not cured. To understand the past is not to live it, it is to deny its echo. Most of the women we talked about were born and died under a single name, Fallen. Today, the language is different, but the feeling is often the same. Modern sex workers still face social shaming, legal discrimination, lack of health care, and housing violence. Without justice, they are often spoken about, not spoken to, just as Victorian women were. The systems are newer. The attitudes are not, And in recent decades, historians, archivists, and grassroots organizations have begun the careful, necessary work of recuperating these lost stories. Sources include unnamed women in disgrace, on workhouse logs, transcripts from police court, replete with unheeded testimony, official hospital and asylum documents, some handwritten and some redacted, the secret diaries of women who went to brothels, not for sex, but as sisters, mothers, and friends, tombstones listing enigmatic inscriptions, including Mary L., aged 23, a friend to many, and most powerfully, the generations of descendants who are just now learning the truth there. Great-great-grandmothers never whispered. These are the new archives, not just of paper, but of memory, blood and revelation. The women of the Victorian brothel will never achieve legal justice. No court will find guilty the society that abandoned it. Nothing will unmake the hunger and violence and humiliation they experienced. But justice is about more than verdicts. Justice is, we say their names when we can, our cultural complicity when we can't, in Absolutely Fantastic. Trump praises Woodward's new, Absolutely Fantastic. Trump praises Woodward's new book, President. Trump praised the new book of his former advisor Bob Woodward, just a day before it was officially released, reclaiming their own dignity via art, research and memory. How we talk about sex, power, poverty and shame. Today's that way memory becomes an act of reparation. When we think of Victorian prostitutes, we must also think about what was taken from them. The chance to study freedom of property ownership, the privilege of parenting with the safety of not looking over your shoulder, the freedom to say no, and have it heeded, the right to live with partners they had chosen. No matter their class or religion, their lives were determined not only by brothels, but by the constraints placed upon them. Many years before they even walked through a madam's door. We must also mourn the artists never painted, the writers never published, the teachers who never had a chance to teach, the mothers who never got to mother. One fluid truth has endured in this series. It wasn't women who built the brothel. It was built on women by systems and structures. And men who profited. Men were the clients, the police, the landlords, the judges, the publishers, the pastors. Their desires shaped the demand. Their laws shaped the supply. And their silence was what formed the forgetting. To remember the women is to face the men, too, not to demonize, but to diffuse the story of innocence. And today, the narrative is being rewritten by writers, filmmakers, and visual artists. Some of the recent works that respect or recast the careers of Victorian sex workers include plays in which the confession of the prostitute has little to do with being the victim, novels from the point of view of women, not the rescuer, street art that acknowledges them and honors them in the concrete jungles they once roamed, digital archives that permit families to track down newly found ancestors long considered too shameful to talk about. Art does not erase pain, but it can convert silence into language, a last utterance of belonging, because some stories can never be pieced back together. For other women, the record stops at a date, a charge, a grave. They left behind no photographs, no descendants, no possessions, nothing other than whispers in ancient ledgers and untold memories. This is perhaps the holiest task, to speak on behalf of people whose names we do not know, whose suffering we cannot describe, whose humanity we can only ascribe by faith. To say, she mattered, even if history did not write you down. You were here. In 13 chapters, we've entered brothel doorways, read diaries by candlelight, followed women through courtrooms, alleyways, and across continents. We have learned that Victorian prostitution was not just about sex. It was about class, gender, race, money, empire, and survival. The women who lived through it were not saints or monsters, only complex thinking, feeling, human beings. Their erasure was deliberate. Who they were and what they experienced is crucial to comprehending the world that came after, and that speaking the truth, no matter how late, is its own kind of revolution.